Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, my name is Rory and you are watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page, a cozy little corner of the internet for narrative. And what we're going to do here tonight is we are going to read old folklore and fairy tales, specifically from Iceland. Second here. Specifically from Iceland, specifically concerning priests who can conduct black magic. I'm going to talk a little bit about this trope, the little bit I can talk about it. I'm not a historian, I'm just a writer. Yeah, if you are here live, though, the good news is there is a live chat who has a little crop of potatoes growing in it as we speak. I see that Jumstore, unfortunately, has an emergency and won't be able to be in the chat today. We will miss you, Jumstore, but I'm sure you will catch us on the VOD. I see Uncle Kitty, Tammy Morelli, and GS. Good to see you, folks. Yeah, if you're not watching this live, though, down in the description below, there will be little timestamps for each of the stories we're reading tonight, of which there are several. You can jump ahead to whichever one interests you the most. They all concern the topic that is on the icon of this video. They're all about priests who have black magic skills. To that end, I'm going to talk a little bit about that as best as I can. And then we'll get on to reading these stories. Also, pardon me, I did... I grabbed some clothing before I started the stream, and it happened to be in an area of the closet I hadn't been in a little while, and stirred up a bunch of dust, so I'm somewhat congested and occasionally coughing. Oh god, the crowns are back. Yeah, I don't know how to get rid of them then. Maybe one day I'll figure it out. Okay, so this is about Iceland, and Iceland is not Scandinavian per se. It is Nordic, but it's not Scandinavian. But it is a place that has obvious cultural roots in Scandinavia, especially as you go further back. And of course, with respect to its very unique cultural traits that distinguishes it from the Scandinavian countries, it probably still ultimately most closely represents a Scandinavian country when considering its relationship to Europe in general. Now, I mentioned that because the Christianization of Scandinavia really did look a lot similar to the Christianization of Iceland. And that is an interesting story in and of itself. There is perhaps a somewhat romantic neo-pagan notion that these places were once fully pagan, then they were bulldozed by Christian persecution practically overnight. But that's not really what happened. What the Christianization of Scandinavia and the North in general looked like was actually several centuries of a slow transition. Where the Catholic Church would be setting up churches, but people were very often maybe not so much resistant to the Catholic Church, but they didn't see it as exclusionary of their own pagan beliefs. And I mention all this because to understand that is to be partway to understanding why Iceland has so many stories of priests who supposedly practice black magic, but are not portrayed as evil for it. It's a bit of an odd trope in folklore. The priest who uses black... Frankly, when I say black magic, by the way, this is, as far as the sort of Christian writers of these folklore and a lot of the people who were passing this folklore on, they mean explicitly magic from the devil. Powers of devilry. But the priests themselves are still portrayed as good men, holy men on the whole. We looked at this phenomenon a bit in Iceland with Soemundur video, I don't know, a couple of months ago, who was a priest who tricked the devil into teaching him magic and then tricked the devil into teaching him magic and then refused to pay the debt and constantly tricked the devil out of it. This is slightly different, but the same basic trope. what is different about these characters tonight, of which we're going to talk about too, is though they are based on real people, like Soementor was, they are relatively more modern. I think up to as far as the 16th century, maybe 17th century, and therefore would have been supposedly existing in a land that was pretty much effectively Catholic at that point and no longer in any sense broadly pagan. The Christianization of Scandinavia and its sort of related territories had occurred by that point. So that's what makes this a particularly interesting to me version of that tale. With Soementor, we're talking about someone from the 10th century, I believe. With, for example, Eiríkur, which we'll talk about, and he's the second one we'll talk about. I think he's from the 1600s. That's a lot more modern. And yet the path is the same. They are holy men, they are priests who have devil's magic, wield it in frankly questionable ways, but are never presented as compromised for it, which also makes them different than like Faust. Because with Faust in Germany, you see the same idea that it's a real person who's associated with devil abilities, but with Faust, it's often shown to be a negative in his life. That doesn't seem to be the case here. So that makes these tales, to me, particularly fascinating because it's not even really clear what the cultural regard of a person is who is like this. So as we go through it, I'd be curious about your thoughts. Oh, I see Janera's here. Really good to hear from you, Janera. Pardon me. That said, it is not as if these stories never present the idea that the Catholic faith maybe wasn't super pleased about somebody conducting black arts. And we will see an example of that in our last story of the night. But anyways, we're going to read stories about two different priests. First one being Priest Hálfdán, and the second one being Priest Eiríkur, who most of the stories are going to be about, who are priests with black magic abilities in Iceland. To that end, breezy cold ocean Iceland. Let's get a little bit of ambiance. Our first tale of the night is called Priest Hálfdán and Ólöf of Lónkot. It is an Icelandic traditional tale from Icelandic Legends, a collection of tales by Jon Arnason, which is a classic collection you can find on Google Books and such for free. A certain old woman named Ólöf lived at a farm called Lónkot, in the parish of Fell, of which Hálfdán was the priest. She was very wise and very well skilled in magic, but by no means an amiable person, rather given to quarreling. Hands up if that's you. She and Hálfdán never got on well together, and many were the high words that passed between them whenever they met. One day in the autumn, the priest and some of his servants were out fishing, and had had the luck to catch a large halibut. As, however, the weather was sharp and frosty, the rowers paid little enough heed to the fish, but blew ruefully on their chilled fingers and grumbled at the cold. Seeing this, Hálfdán said to them, "What would you give me, my lads, if I caught a good large hot sausage for you now?" They shook their heads, said that he could not do so, skillful as he was, and looked more wretched than before. But the priest threw out a line over the edge of the boat, and in an instant dragged up on the end of it a large sausage, so hot that it bubbled and sputtered again, and the rowers could hardly believe their eyes, but spent a mighty short time in wondering, finding that the best way to test the reality of the sausage was to eat it, which they forthwith did. But when they had finished their meal, lo, the halibut was no more to be seen. "Aha!" said the priest. "Something the old woman must have for her hot sausage." The truth was that Hálfdán had enchanted the sausage from Dame Ólöf. But she, like many other good folk we could mention, was not disposed to give a thing away when she could sell it at a price, and so she paid herself by enchanting the halibut from Hálfdán. Pardon me? That's our first story of Priest Hálfdán. And we're going on to our second one. So in that one, it's more about this lady who apparently has black magic skills and he just works with her. Yeah, we'll see a slightly different version of that with Hálfdán here, and then we'll move on to sort of the star of our piece, the true black magician, which is Priest Eiríkur. Our next tale is called Priest Hálfdán and the Devil, and it also comes to us from Jon Arnison's classic collection, Icelandic Legends, which you can get just about anywhere for free. One winter, when it was rather late in the season, it chanced that Priest Hálfdán was in great need of dried fish for household use, his home stock having quite run out. He sent in all directions to his neighbors' houses, offering to buy from them what fish they could spare, but they were in just the same plight as himself, for the season had been bad everywhere, and the people suffered much from it. As was the custom in those times, the priest kept a large number of fishing boats at Greasy, where they were also lying in a vast quantity of fish stacked for the winter. But so stormy was the sea, and the weather, rather, at this time, and so dangerous the sea, that all hope in this quarter was quite cut off. But Hálfdán, who saw no pleasure in starving when there was fish to be had somewhere, called in the devil and said to him, "If you will go to Greasy and bring me thence dried fish enough for the rest of the winter, without wetting them, you shall have my soul." What a thing for a priest to say to the devil himself. "If, however, I find one drop of water upon the fish, ye shall lose your bargain." Well, the devil was not a little pleased at this, snatched at the offer hastily enough, making, however, the condition that the priest should provide him with the craft. "Oh, yes," said Hálfdán, "what's easier?" And forthwith gave him an old kitchen coal scuttle. But bad as this ship was, the devil was bound to make the best of it, and so addressed himself to his journey late in the afternoon. Next morning, the priest's wife came out to see how went the weather, and the priest called out after her, saying, "How looks the sky?" "Fair enough," said she, "but there is a dark cloud in the north, which covers rapidly the heavens." "Aha," replied her husband, who was still in bed. "It is time to get up then. and the devil has done his work right speedily." Upon which he got up, and dressing himself in haste, left the house. The devil was now quite close to the shore. But when he saw Hálfdán, he lost his courage, and started in his seat, so that the surf broke over the coal scuttle, and wet the tails of all the fish. And as soon as he had landed, he delivered the great bundle of fish to the priest, who was not long in finding the water upon their tails, and who at once declared himself to have got the best of the bargain. To this the devil had nothing to say, and was thinking of looking very crestfallen, when, so says the story, the priest cut off the wet tails of the fish, and flinging them into old Nick's face, cried, There is freight payment for you." And ever since, the thinnest part of the fish's tail has been called the devil's flap. I'll be honest, the devil's flap sounds like dirty slang. And it's a shame that Jump Story isn't here to capitalize on it. Alright. So those first two tales, we see a little bit of this idea that priests of the time were sort of engaging with dark arts and devilry and running that risk. I think the idea is supposed to be, though, that the priest is the smartest person in the world, being touched by God, and always knows how to get out of it. And the thing about the next sequence of tales, which there are, let me just count here, I didn't think to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tales of priest Eiríkur, is it's not so clear that he always knows what he's doing, to be honest. I mean, maybe that's debatable, but it's also not so clear that he's simply, using the devil. He just kind of uses black magic to questionable uses at times. Anyhow. GS says the priest has several fishing boats. He's doing well. As I understand it, priests did pretty well in these days. All right. Our next tale is called Priest Eiríkur's Handbook. And it comes to us from Icelandic Legends, a collection by Jon Arnason, a book you can find for free just about anywhere on the internet. Now you shall hear several strange stories about Priest Eiríkur of Vososa, who seems to have been as wonderful a person as Somentar the Learned himself. The fame of his learning and his wisdom, more particularly in the black art, was so widely spread abroad that many young men used to come to him and ask him to teach them, even from quite distant parts of the country of Iceland. But he used to put those who came to him to some sort of trial, and if he found them worthy of his pains, well and good, he taught them as much as they could learn, but if they failed to please him, he sent them off about their business. Among others, once came to him a lad who craved his instructions in magic. "Stay with me over next Sunday," said Eiríkur to him. "Come with me that day to Krisavik, and after that I will tell you my mind." Accordingly, on Sunday morning they rode from home together, but when they came to a tract of country called Sandur, Eiríkur said, "Oh, I have forgotten my handbook. It is under my pillow. Go therefore and fetch it for me, but beware not to open it." While the lad returned for the book as instructed and rode back with it, longing and longing, but not daring to look into it. When he arrived at Sandur, however, his curiosity got the better of his wisdom. And so he just a bit, opened the book. And then a bit more, and looked right into it. But suddenly he found himself surrounded by a countless host of devils, who cried, "What shall we do? What shall we do?" "Do?" answered he quickly. "Why, plait cables out of the sand." Upon which all the devils sat down and fell to their task. But the lad rode on till he caught up to Priest Eiríkur, who was by now far in advance, and he gave the book to him, as if nothing had happened at all. But Eiríkur was wise. "You have opened it," said the priest. "No," said the lad, "not I." And when they were on their way home again, and came to Santer, there were all the devils hard at work, though to be sure they had not yet made a single rope between them. And as soon as the priest saw them, he said, "I knew well enough, my good lad, that you had opened the book in spite of your denial and insistence. But you have acted with such presence of mind that I see plainly it will be well worth my while to teach you." So from that time forth the lad became Eiríkur's pupil. The story does not say a word more about the devils who tried to plait cables out of the sand at Santer, but there can be no doubt whatever that after a while they must have just given up on the task as a clearly fruitless one, for they are assuredly not at work there now. Our next tale is called Eiríkur and the Beggar-woman. It also comes to us from Icelandic legends by Jon Arneson. One day, as was wont to do, two men came to Eiríkur at Vosasa and begged him to teach them the magic art. He looked very much amazed at the idea and said that as he knew nothing of magic, he could teach them nothing. "But," continued he, "you have come far and are weary. Spend therefore the night at my house and be welcome." They agreed willingly to this, and after a good supper rested that night at the priest's house. Next morning betimes, Eiríkur asked them to ride with him around the farm and see his fields and stocks. They had ridden but a very little distance from the house when an old woman met them who had a child at her breast, and walking up to Eiríkur begged him in piteous tones and with many tears to help her in her need. But Eiríkur became wroth, and roughly telling her that he should do nothing of the sort, made as if to ride quickly past her. She, however, caught a hold of his bridle and entreated him again in the name of heaven to help her, as she was a widow and had neither home nor food nor money. And at this Eiríkur waxed still more wroth and cried, "I am weary to death of this eternal whining. A good thing it would be, I think, if someone were to kill all you beggars and troublesome wenches that you are." And still the old woman wept and clung to his bridle. Then Eiríkur, turning to the two men, said, "You must kill this old hag for me if you wish me to teach you any of my magic." And one of them answered him, "Oh, never thought I, Eiríkur, that you were so godless a man. No such crime as this will I commit, whatever price I get for it." "I see no particular harm in it," said the other stranger. "And if Priest Eiríkur will it, I'll slay this old witch with pleasure. Surely it's a good thing to rid the land of the like, and they ought to be themselves thankful to be soon quit of their wretched lives. With which words he would have ridden at the beggar, but lo, she was no longer with them. Aha, said Eiríkur. You may go your way, my friend. Never will I teach such a heartless, impious fellow. But the stranger who had first spoken he took to himself as his pupil. The raising up of this old woman by jugglery. Amazing, I've never heard this word used this way. They use it twice, jugglery. Amazing. Was one of the many ways in which Eiríkur was wont to prove those who came to him to learn magic. I like that story a good deal, because it really doesn't overplay its hand, and because you never quite know what the ethics of folklore is going to be. When you're reading it, you're like, I don't know, maybe Eiríkur is kind of a jerk. But no, it pulls you back in. Gia says, I'm a whole 1% Icelandic. I don't even know if I'm Icelandic. Probably in some thin way. As I've mentioned before, I'm Scottish and Orkney via Norway. So old Orkney. Or Orcadian. Amongst the smattering of other things. But, you know, that Nordic influence, maybe somebody Icelandic showed up at some point. All right. Gennaro says, I do love moral tests like that in story. I like that one because it makes sense to me. A lot of folklore has moral tests that are nuts and do not make any sense to me. All right. Our next tale is called Eiríkur's Saturday Afternoon. How's your Saturday afternoon? And it comes to us also from Jon Arnarsson's Icelandic Legends. Eiríkur was wont every Saturday afternoon to disappear from his farm without anybody knowing whither he went. Once a youth who was learning under him, moved by curiosity, begged leave to go with him on one of those occasions, but met for a long time with an utter refusal. Let me just mention right now a little bit of a content warning on this one. It's weird and dark. You will gain no good by it, said Eiríkur. You will do better to remain at home. However, as the youth only became more urgent in his entreaties, the priest at last yielded to him. Some weeks passed, and one Saturday the priest bade the youth follow him. They walked together till they came to a hill, which stood in the farm enclosure, or tún. Eiríkur knocked with his staff upon the mound, which once opened of itself, and out came an aged lady who greeted Eiríkur in a friendly manner, begging him to enter. There came out too a maiden, who took the young man by the hand and bade him also come in. And so they went in, and came to the family room, and all around of which a number of people were sitting. Eiríkur and the youth took their seats by the door, the latter being next to it. Now nobody spoke a single word, not a hushed whisper, nothing. A thing which the man found strange enough, but great indeed was his wonder when the two ladies left the room, and after a while returned with a huge trough. So imagine like a V of wood on a little stand. It's important for picturing what's coming next. And a knife, and on going up to the first man on the other side of the door, took him, threw him down, and cut his throat with a knife, letting the blood run into the trough. And then they took the next one, treated him in the same way, and thus the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and so on, always in order. But the strangest part of the whole business was that nobody made the slightest resistance, or betrayed the least fear, nor did anybody speak. And then the youth looked at Eiríkur to see what he thought about it, but Eiríkur was unmoved. Still, the ladies went on slaughtering each man in turn, amid a silence only broken by the gurgle and bubble of blood splashing into the trough, till they came to Eiríkur. There we go. Whom they took, flung down, and slew in the same way. By this time the youth had seen a great deal more than enough, and starting up with a loud cry, took to his heels and never ceased running till he came to the farm. When he arrived there, pale and breathless, and with his knees knocking together with fear, whom should he see leaning against the door post but priest Eiríkur himself? "What are you running so fast for, my man?" said he. "Are you in a hurry?" At this the other looked sheepish enough and did not know what to say, for he at once saw that he had been duped by one of the priest's juggling tricks. "Ah," continued Eiríkur, "I always thought, my good fellow, that you had not the courage to see anything out of the common, and now I am sure about it." Not to question Eiríkur here, but what the hell? This isn't something out of the common. It's a ritualistic murder of several men where you see that you're next. I don't know why the reaction to that should be cool. Bring it in, baby. Like that just folklore, am I right? We're talking about ancestry in the chat. Uncle Kitty says, "Wow, that got dark quick." It sure did. Like, it's better to know that it didn't happen, but it's also kind of disturbing that this was what the man chose to do with this kid's time. This one's a little more on the funny side. GS says Rory's living it up with Zevia tonight. Zevia, it won't make you believe your neck will get cut. But it'll make you wish it was. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Our next tale is called The Horse Stealers, and it still concerns the cycle of priest Eiríkur. It comes to us from Icelandic Legends by Jon Arnarson, collection you can find just about anywhere. Priest Eiríkur always warned all the herdsmen and other lads in the neighborhood of Vossasa against taking his riding horses without his leave, as horse stealing was very common in those parts, assuring them that if they disobeyed him, it would be at their peril. Now this put an end to the thefts for a long while, for the herdsmen held Eiríkur in great awe and knew full well that he meant what he said. Two boys, however, thinking they could have a capital ride without its ever coming to the priest's ears, mounted two of Eiríkur's horses, which were grazing far from the farm. But they were no sooner seated than off ran the horses at a mad pace towards Vossasa, where priest Eiríkur was, and without there being in any way able either to guide or check the horses. And as soon as they saw that the horses were not to be managed, the lads tried to throw themselves off onto the ground, but lo, that was not to be done, for their trousers had grown to the horses' backs. "This won't do," said one of the lads. "We must get off somehow, or the horses will take us to Priest Eiríkur himself, and I don't at all care to fall into his hands." Fortunately, the pictures in this book are quite blurry, so I won't dwell on that one, but it's them trying to get off the horses. And with these words, he took a knife from his pocket and, cutting the part of his clothes which had grown to the horse's back, thus freed himself and leaped onto the ground. But the other, either because he was not sharp enough or because he did not wish to spoil his trousers, stuck where he was, shouting for help. So the horses galloped home to Vossasar, the one with the screaming lad on its back, the other with the patch of trousers. And the priest was outside the door when the horses came running home, and stopping them, he took the patch of cloth from the back of the one and said to the boy, who sat looking very helpless and miserable on the back of the other, "Well, you find stealing horses of Priest Eiríkur of Vossasar great fun, no doubt. Get off now, and take my advice. Never touch my horses again, or it will be the worse for you. As for the other lad, he had more spirit than you, and deserves to be taught a little, for he promises to turn out a hopeful fellow." And soon after it happened that the boy came to the priest, who showed him the piece of cloth and asked him whether he knew it. Without betraying the least fear, the lad told him all about the matter. Eiríkur was as much pleased with his openness as with his presence of mind, smiled and bade him come henceforth and live with him, an offer which he gratefully accepted. So the youth dwelt with Priest Eiríkur and was very faithful to him, and learned of him, so people say, more than most folk know of the ancient art of magic. Uncle Kitty says, imagine trying to pitch that in a meeting. I have questions, many questions. Regarding the Zevia tagline, our customers don't get murdered in the night by Icelandic priests. GS says, oh, Iceland is Lutheran. That would explain why he had a wife. All right. As well as Catholic. I mean, yeah, the Catholics were pretty much everywhere at that point. That's true. But I didn't know about the Lutheran influence, but I guess that makes sense, especially for this era. Yeah. Eiríkur and the Farmer is the name of our next tale, and it comes to us from Icelandic Legends by Jon Arnason. In Eiríkur's parish of Vossasar, there lived a certain farmer who never went to church, and having a grudge against the priest, used to, on purpose, annoy him, go out fishing on the Sunday, whenever the weather was favorable. One Sunday, Eiríkur was going to church to perform service, and passed on his way the house of the farmer, who, guessing when the priest would go by, just managed to be putting on his skin leggings at the moment. Seeing this, Eiríkur addressed him with courteous words, and asked him if he would not, for once, go to church that day. And the farmer rudely said, "No," continued putting on his skin trousers, without paying any further heed to the priest, who left him and went on to the church. Now when the service was over, Eiríkur returned home the same way as he had come, and passing the farmer's house, saw him through the open door, sitting with one leg of his skin trousers on and the other off. "Ah, my friend," said the priest to him, "I dare say you've had a good draught today, since you are back so soon." But the farmer, looking very crestfallen, was obliged to own that he had not moved from the spot since the priest had seen him last, and begged him to free him, as he could neither lift hand nor foot. Eiríkur answered, "If you find the devil strong enough to hold you now, what think you will he be able to do with you by and by?" And with these words freed him from the seat, to which by his magic arts he had bidden the devil to bind him. Even after this, the man went to church on Sundays, became one of the best men in the parish. It's funny because in most of these stories, honestly, Eiríkur is a bit of a jerk. But they are very charming little, lessons. I don't know how consistent this is. He kind of sounds like a madman, to be honest. But I do enjoy the fact that all of them have a kind of cycle of he kind of tests them and then they learn something about themselves. Just as a story structure, I think it's fun. I don't know about him as a person. He honestly seems like a bit of a power-hungry know-it-all. But maybe you disagree. All right. Now this next tale is the first time we really see... It's the first time we really see how Eiríkur is seen to fit in with the larger church. Now, this is about Eiríkur and the bishop. That's right. Do Lutherans have bishops? I don't think they do. Someone in chat will tell me. Maybe he is Catholic then. Genera says he'd be boring if he weren't. That's true. It's true. But yeah, in terms of trying to analyze where this kind of guy would land if you were telling this story in the times when it was told, what they would regard of a priest using this kind of dark arts and so on, and calling upon the devil to do his bidding and blah, 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 blah. This is the first one where we get a bit of insight. We also get a bit of insight that Eiríkur might not be considered the best person by the end of this tale either, even in the structure of the narrative. All right. I think we can all guess why, Uncle Kitty. Our next tale is called Eiríkur and the Bishop. It also comes to us from Jan Arnesson's Icelandic Legends. The Bishop of Skelholt heard from time to time such stories of the witchcraft and strange doings of Eiríkur, that at last he thought it high time to strip that priest of his gown. So one winter he sent 18 of the pupils from the school, bidding him in his name publicly to strip Eiríkur of his robes and deprive him of his office. And so they started on their journey one fine day, not a little proud of their errand, for it showed how much trust the bishop put in them, and as they rode along talked very big about the same, and would do mighty things when it came to that point. Gia says Lutherans have bishops. I had no idea. One morning, priest Eiríkur got up early and went out of the house, and after a while he came back groaning heavily, as if in pain or sorrow, and bade his people not on any account to let the beasts go out to pasture that day, as said he thought he saw some signs of foul weather. Shortly after, he came on so fearful a storm and so deep a fall of snow that the people who wished The people who wished to cross from one part of the farm buildings to another could scarcely stand out of doors for the wind and the heavy drift. A little after noon, somebody knocked at the door, and the priest, on opening it, found that it was one of the youths sent by the bishop, so he asked him in. And after a while came another, and then another, and then a fourth, till by evening every one of the 18 had come. Did they not travel together in a snowstorm? Doesn't that seem ill-advised? Oh, right. The story does tell me this. Sorry. Forget my own story. They had lost their way in the snowdrift and been separated from one another. And thus it was that, instead of coming to Vossasa in a body, they came singly. I did know this. Eiríkur treated them with the greatest hospitality, and gave them changes of clothes, stabled their horses, and had withal so winning a manner that his guests became too fond of him to be able to carry out the bishop's orders, and to strip him of his gown. Accordingly, next morning they started from Vossasa, and with the kind farewells of Eiríkur, and in course of time came to Skelholt. When the bishop heard how their journey had ended, and that they had done nothing whatsoever, he was filled with displeasure, and vowed that he would go to Vossasa himself and see how Eiríkur would get off then. Now the winter passed away, and when the summer was at its full, the bishop left Skelholt with a numerous band, and when he arrived at Vossasa, he pitched his tents outside the wall of the tun. This being on a weekday, the bishop determined to wait till the Sunday and then to strip the priest of his gown. He warned his men earnestly to receive nothing from the hands of Eiríkur, and having given them this order, took his way to the house and called the priest before him. Eiríkur received the bishop cordially, and was so very merry, and so perfectly at his ease, that his reverence did not know how to begin. So he asked to see the church, and Eiríkur therefore took him to it. And the bishop could not help being pleased with the good order everything there was in. But while the latter was in the church, one of his servants passed by in order to get fire from the farm, and Eiríkur, who was in the porch, called the man to him, and having greeted him in the sweetest and most friendly way, he pulled a bottle of wine from his pocket and begged him to taste it. "No," said the man, "I dare not. It would be against the bishop's strictest orders." But the more he refused, the more Eiríkur pressed him, till at last the man, overcome by his entreaties, put his mouth to the bottle and took a draught. And it was not such a very short draught either, for he thought that in all his days he had never tasted such good wine. And when he had drunk, he begged Eiríkur to give him a bottle that he might refresh the bishop with it anonymously. Secretly laughing at the success of his trick, Eiríkur willingly gave him the rest of the wine, and off went the man with the bottle in his pocket. Then the bishop came out of the church and returned to his tent, and while Eiríkur went home and waited to see how things would turn out, at dinner the servant man poured wine into the bishop's glass, who had no sooner tasted it than he quite changed his mind about Eiríkur, and after dinner went to the priest's house and stayed a week there in the greatest mirth and good fellowship. At the end of that time, he returned to Skullhoft with all of his company. This was the way in which Eiríkur duped the bishop and kept his gown on his back. So the question for the group is he supposed to be a good priest? Like, it's really not ultimately very clear how we're supposed to regard Eiríkur. We have one more story left for him. When his own bishop doesn't like what he's doing, and instead of like redressing it or explaining why actually, you know, it's in the interest of God and whatever, he enchants his own people so that they go away and tricks through lies. Like, it's really very strange. It's not usually how you would, like, for example, there's lots of Celtic stories, specifically, frankly, Irish stories about magical priests. But in those tales, the priests are sort of unassailably moral. You know, they have powers over devils and stuff, but it's very much tied to their incorruptible moral fiber, at least as far as the era would have regarded them. But in this, like, the priest is just clever. It's not even really clear what about him is a priest. Uncle Kitty says bishops are usually regarded as depraved madmen. Eiríkur may be considered preferable to him. Like, I don't know if this is indeed Lutheran. I don't know how much that follows in the Lutheran traditions. And I don't know about Iceland, because Iceland, this is the thing in Iceland, right? That's kind of what we're talking about tonight. So Imentur, the Hálfdán that we were talking about at the beginning, and now Eiríkur. These are priests who use the dark arts of the devil, often just for their own gain or fun. Yeah, GS says he's handy. He can use religion or black magic as it suits him. Well, without sort of overplaying my hand, kind of what I was introducing at the beginning is, I think why a lot of this appears is because there was so many centuries where that was sort of the way you looked at it. You know, Christianity was one god and rituals among many, and in that very pagan way we've talked about before, you'd sort of appeal and appease the ones that, you know, suited your purposes. If you wanted a good harvest, you would appease the harvest god, so on thing. And that the devil and Jesus and all of that were very much the same sort of story. Like, if you could outsmart the devil, then you got his powers, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, you were just good at it. And maybe that was a sort of more traditional understanding of sages and priests and so on. I don't really know. Again, I'm not a historian. I'm curious to see what people think. This last story is far and away the most confusing for me, because I really, really don't understand. We get no information on a really key detail in it that the whole story hinges on. And because we get no information on it, it really casts a lot of doubt on what kind of person Eiríkur is supposed to be in these stories. This is our last story, though. So, I will be quite curious how you guys assess the priest Eiríkur after this one, because it is peculiar. Our next and last story of the night is called Eiríkur and the Convict. It also comes to us from Icelandic Legends by Jon Arnarsson. Northwest of Vossasa, in the great lava plain, there is a cavern called Gapi. which is often used as a shelter and resting place by travelers passing that way. In this cavern, Eiríkur hid a convict. This history saith not why. That is the detail that really matters for trying to make sense of this story. For a whole summer, and so enchanted the place that neither could anybody find the cave itself nor the cairn of stones which had been raised on a neighboring hill to mark it. The convict was from one of the eastern districts, namely, Sita. And having murdered another, he had been condemned to lose his head. The whole summer the man remained there, while papers were sent out all over the country describing him and offering a reward to any who should catch him. Priest Eiríkur, having got one of these bills, sent the convict himself with it to Sita, having first so transformed him by magic art that nobody could know him, and bade him say that the murderer had been caught in the district of Selvahur, and was now sitting loaded with fetters in the church at Strand. Upon hearing this, the people of Sita at once set off southwards, and coming to the church at Strand, found there sitting loaded with chains the man whom they sought. So they seized him, took him to the east, and made preparations for cutting off his head, according to the sentence which had been passed upon him. But when it came to the point, the axe would not cut, and bent at every stroke upon the man's neck. Accordingly, the good folk of Sita were obliged to give up the attempt, and agreed to take him on board a ship bound for Denmark, in which the country they hoped the axes would be a little sharper. But no sooner had they taken him on board the ship than his human form vanished. And they found that they had put themselves to all this pain and trouble for a block of stone with 2 arms. The sailors, as soon as they saw this, made a great game of the people of Sita, and rated them right soundly for their blindness, so that the good folk made all haste to shore covered with shame, not however before they had seen their convict hurled overboard. Now they began to see that they had been made fools of by Eiríkur, and bursting with rage, they determined to revenge themselves upon him for all the trouble they'd been put to, and for the silly figures they cut in the eyes of the Danish sailors. To carry out their vengeance, they bribed a man from the West Firths, who dabbled in magic, to send a great cat to slay Eiríkur. When Puss arrived of Vossasa, Eiríkur was outside his door in company with the young man who had formerly opened his handbook and bidden the devils to weave the ropes from sand. The cat ran up with great strides and flaming eyes, and sprang at the priest's neck, intending to fix herself there and kill him. But Eiríkur was too quick for her, and as the youth aided him with a right good will, Puss got the worst of the battle, and before long lay dead upon the ground. That is our picture today on our token of them fighting the cat off. Icon, rather. Thumbnail, I guess. Now, the story goes on to say that Eiríkur forthwith dispatched a sending to the man in the West Firths, and put an end to him almost as quickly as to his gobbling cat. We did talk about sendings a while back. And that's where the story ends. It's also actually the end of the book, though we haven't read every story in this book. It's the end of the book. Let me summarize. Eiríkur at times seems to, at least in one story, very much embodies Christian principles of charity, sussing out if a man's going to use power for it in a good way. But then we get confusing things where he manipulates his own bishop with magic. He hides a murderer away from justice. It's not clear why. I mean, I guess the most generous assumption would be that he believed them to be innocent, but then the story doesn't seem to know that, nor does it really ever present itself as if that is the case. And then he, rather than just sort of hide the man and ship him off somewhere else so that he can live his life, he makes fools and humiliates the people of his own district, who obviously get quite upset. A man sends a cat after to kill him, and he just kills him back. So not exactly turning other cheeks. What a strange character. It could be the case, but I don't think this is the case because, like I said, Eiríkur is based on a real priest. Just as Soimundur was, Soimundur the Learned. They're based on real priests. I mean, there's no reason to believe they did any of these things. They're based on them. But there's no reason to believe that the stories that we're hearing were ever not intended to be about a priest. I just don't... I'm fascinated by him as a character. I'm fascinated by him as a character because he was carried in this sort of neutral way forward several centuries in folklore, and I desperately want to know what the people telling these stories would have thought of him. It's so unclear, and he's all over the map. The man does not seem in any way Christian, I will say that. Even in that kind of rustic old school way where it was a little more gray, he seems far, far more like a sort of pagan sage or something that we've seen in other stories, where they are, a little strange, a little hard to understand, very powerful and therefore respected, generally do good, but not always. Sometimes they're sort of, like, he seems like that kind of character. Anyways, I won't babble on too long because we've been going for an hour now and it is getting very warm in here, even though it is much cooler than it was last week. GS says Rasputin. Yeah. Like he does have more of a Rasputin quality to him. That's a good comparison. Yeah. Uncle Kitty, I was reading a little bit about him. He was apparently a farm owner and known for fighting trolls and draugr. Which we've told a lot of stories about those before. Which is more what I would expect from a Christian figure of folklore like this. But yeah. Tammy says, sorry, I wasn't in the chat much, but these were wonderful stories. Hope everyone had a great night. Sweet, sweet dreams, all you amazing peeps. That's okay, Tammy. It's good to hear from you. You're having a hard time with your puppers. Well, I hope you're having a better time now. Also, really lovely to see you, Genera. Hope your father's still doing well, or as well as he can be. And good to see you, GS and Uncle Kitty, and I'm sorry that Jump Store wasn't able to hang out, and anybody else who's hanging out in the background is really good to hang out with you, even if I don't specifically know you're there. I feel you in my heart. As for me, I'll keep the fire going. You folks, have yourself a good sleep. you.